Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colonel Todd Randolph, visiting fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York City. Prior to this assignment, I served as the installation commander at Joint Base Andrews, Maryland. Joining me tonight and always is my beautiful wife, Penny. We have served on active duty for over 35 years, the first 11 as an enlisted airman and the last 24 as a personnel officer. We've commanded at the squadron, group, and wing levels, served a one-year deployment in Iraq during Operations New Dawn and Enduring Freedom. We served joint duty on the Office of Secretary of Defense staff. And we also served as the executive officer for our air demonstration squadron, the Thunderbirds. It is indeed an honor for Penny and I to be here with you tonight on these hallowed grounds to pay tribute to our nation's real heroes on Veterans Day. It's my pleasure to welcome to tonight's very special program, Above and Beyond, the Air Force Response on 9/11. I'd like to extend a special welcome to museum members and those tuning in to the live web broadcast. Tonight's program is offered virtually in conjunction with the 7th Annual 9/11 Memorial and Museum Summit on Security, presented by FISERV, which brings together many of the world's leading voices from across the public and private sectors to build on the discussion of how we can all make our companies, cities, and nations safer. I would also like to acknowledge members of the Sunny Maritime Reserve Officer Training Corps who are in attendance this evening, along with the leadership and future airmen of the 313th Flight Squadron. As a prelude to the Above and Beyond panel discussion you're about to hear, let me share very briefly some of the immediate actions our security forces teammates initiated in response to 9/11 attacks. Most of us remember exactly where we were on 9/11. For us, we were stationed at Andrews Air Force Base with our three sons, Richard, Sean, and Tavon. I was a second lieutenant in my first assignment as an officer, serving as the section commander for the 89th Security Forces Squadron. It was a typical day for our defenders, tactically posted around the base, standing watch, securing the most visible military installation and flight line in the world, where we enabled the safe execution of special air missions supporting the President of the United States and senior government officials around the world. When suddenly I heard a scream. An airplane just flew into the World Trade Center. We rushed to the television and watched in horror as smoke billowed from the building. We never imagined this was an act of terrorism. It wasn't long before we witnessed live at 9:03 when the second plane flew into the South Tower. Information began to confirm America was indeed under attack. Shortly thereafter, we learned a third plane struck the Pentagon, with a fourth plane unaccounted for. The intensity and anxiety in the security forces building was palpable. It was assumed the fourth plane could be targeting the Capitol, the White House, or Andrews Air Force Base, home of Air Force One. Our security forces expedited base lockdown procedures, recalled additional defenders to fortify the base, and prepared to engage the enemy. Our American heroes on that fourth plane ensured the enemy didn't reach its target. Above and Beyond response on that tragic day. Tonight's program highlights the Air Force's response on 9/11 through the accounts of three superior aviators who served with the 121st Fighter Squadron: Lieutenant General Daniel Caine, Major Heather Penney, and Lieutenant General Marc Sasseville. Lieutenant General Daniel Caine is a former flight commander and chief of weapons and tactics for the United States Air Force. He has served in a wide range of operational staff and joint assignments and currently serves as the Associate Director of Military Affairs for the Central Intelligence Agency. Major Penney joined the DC Air National Guard 3 years after Congress opened combat aviation to women. The first and only woman in the 121st Fighter Squadron, Heather deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom for initial combat operations and flew the F-16 for 10 years. After working at Lockheed Martin, she is now a senior resident fellow for the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies at the Air Force Association. Lieutenant General Marc Sasseville was the 12th Vice Chief of the National Guard Bureau. As Vice Chief, he performed duties as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of the Army, and Secretary of the Air Force. This past June, he retired from the National Guard after 39 years of service. Thank you all, panel members. We thank you for sharing your insights with us tonight about that day and the years since. Please join me one more time in welcoming our guests in conversation with the 9/11 Memorial and Museum President and CEO and former Air Force officer, Dr. Beth Hillman.
Thank you, Colonel Randolph, and thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. It's a special honor to have this program on Veterans Day. I had a chance to join the parade, the New York City Veterans Day Parade, the biggest in the country, and to see how the city supports its veterans, and to have three of the folks who are connected closely to they're part of the 9/11 response and also have been leaders ever since. It's a great honor to be here tonight, so thank you for joining us. I'm also grateful it's an Air Force program because I don't always get to talk about my Air Force colleagues or hear from my Air Force colleagues here at the Memorial Museum, so I appreciate that. So I'm going to start by asking our esteemed panelists to talk a little bit about the community they've joined since 9/11 and their connection to each other. You know, they're all, as you started to hear here, they're all from that 121st Fighter Squadron. They all were at Andrews Air Force Base that day, and they all fly the F-16. But there's more that actually ties them together now. So I'm going to start with you, Major Penney, just to talk about that.
Well, first, thank you so much. It is really a privilege to be able to be here at the memorial, especially on today where we remember those who gave their lives to serve. And there were so many individuals who served here on these hallowed grounds. So first, let me say that on that day, September 11th, I was a baby fighter pilot. I was super green. I had just barely earned my combat mission ready status, and these two men sitting next to me were my heroes, and they still are. For their leadership, their personal courage, their knowledge, and how they invested and cultivated the entire fighter squadron. Because I was just there, as I said, as a baby lieutenant, and it was really their leadership, their vision, their initiative, and their skill. And frankly, also the respect and the relationships and trust that they had earned amongst the broader leadership team there at the 121st that enabled us to respond in the way that we did.
Thank you, Major Penney. General Sasseville.
So thank you on a couple fronts. Thanks for the invitation to be here. This is a real treat. I have not been here except for one time, and that was recently, last December. So this is my first trip to the museum, and it's a significant and emotional event for me. So I'll just leave it there. I also want to say happy Veterans Day to the veterans. I see a bunch of blue uniforms out there and some bald heads that probably have a little bit of time in service as well. Speaking of squadrons, shout out to my buddy Kuda Vanko and his wife Lisa. We flew F-16s back in the early 90s at Homestead Air Force Base. So it's great to see you all. And it's nice to be here with my squadron mates. We haven't been, all three of us, like I said earlier, in one spot at the same time. The squadron is just a very special place. When you serve, and you talked about Security Forces Squadron, that's just it's a fantastic place for young people to be. You create bonds like you see here that will last a lifetime. You'll appreciate every minute you spend in there. It's not all easy, and I'm looking at the next generation over here who hopefully stays Air Force. There's some Navy in here, I think, she said, right? All right, sorry about that. One. But for you guys, the squadron's just a fantastic place to make bonds, to actually do things for your country and to answer your nation's call. And then we're still part of that community. So thanks for letting me ramble on for a minute.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, like Sass said, by the way, your hair is magnificent. Back to the
Retiree
comment.
hairdo.
Yeah, it's awesome. And this is the first time that we've done an event together, so it's humbling to be on the stage with these two. And your question was about the community that we've joined, and that day was a day that none of us will forget. For me in particular, my pilot training teammate, a guy named Joe McGrady, was an F-15 pilot that scrambled up here over New York. I'm the son of his eldest. I'm the godfather of his eldest son. And over the years, Joe and I remained very close, but I've also gotten to know people like Ben Sliney, who made the courageous decision that morning to land all the airplanes, making our decision exponentially easier. I've also gotten to know people like Chief Joe Pfeiffer and other people in the crowd right here. And, for us, it's incredibly humbling for me to meet those that did much more than we did that day. We just did our job. It was the firefighters who knew what they were doing by climbing those stairs. It was the first responders at the Pentagon. And for us, most importantly, it was those passengers on Flight 93 that knew clearly and unambiguously what was happening. And yet they had the courage, they had the tenacity to move forward in that airplane and take matters into their own hands. And so when I talk about September 11th and how the United States began to respond, people say, well, we responded when we went into Afghanistan. And I say, no, we responded within minutes. And that's the fabric of this country as they move forward. So I think the cohort for us out at Andrews is much bigger than just the 121st Fighter Squadron now. It's comprised of legendary humans that still walk this earth and even more legendary humans that don't anymore.
Thank you, General Caine. I wondered, perhaps you'll start for us, General Caine. Can you walk us through what happened that day for you?
Sure. Our squadron at Andrews had just returned from an exercise called Red Flag. We were preparing to deploy to do what was then the Southern No-Fly Zone. I think it was the Southern No-Fly Zone. And it was like here in New York, a beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky. That morning, I was the supervisor of flying initially, which means I was responsible for representing the wing commander and the flying hour program. We actually had 3 airplanes that were already flying, and we just stepped into a scheduling meeting where we were sort of laying out the tactical plan for the week when one of our young airmen from the back vault, our enlisted intelligence specialist, came in and said an airplane had just hit the World Trade Center. And as the supervisor of flying, one of my responsibilities was to monitor the weather. And my first thought was, boy, did I get the weather forecast wrong? Because I assumed that this was similar to the tragic accident when an airplane had hit the World Trade Center before in the weather. But when I walked...
The Empire State Building, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the Empire State Building. Thank you. Appreciate you all correcting me. Don't come to New York and get it wrong. But when I walked into the squadron lounge where we had a big screen TV, there's so many Polaroid images that I'm sure all of us that were alive that day remember. And for me, one of those Polaroids was the news helicopter shot as the first tower was burning, and stood there in the squadron bar when the second airplane flew into the second tower. So that's how the morning started for me.
General Sasseville?
What he said. We're basically all watching the same movie. Just to add, the entire environment starting to really wonder, how do we respond? And Andrews Air Force Base is the home of Air Force One. You probably all know that. And there is a interesting dynamic on Andrews Air Force Base that hosts the president. So there's a very high level of security when Air Force One takes off and lands. And there's always an exchange of information that goes back and forth with the rest of we call them tenants, people who are also assigned to the Air Force Base and fly in and out. And one of the more important conversations that happened with the folks there at Andrews Air Force Base and with the White House Operations Center that morning were instrumental in our response, right? So there's a lot of activity that's starting to bubble up. People are trying to understand what's happened, trying to pull in information, and trying to put together follow-on plans in our reaction.
Major Penney.
So, again, I'm a young lieutenant, and Raisin looks at me and he goes, Lucky, I want you and Igor, Brandon Rasmussen, he was an active duty captain who was doing some seasoning days with us. I want you to go build up DTCs. And so Raisin told us how to build up the mission planning materials for that day. But how do you...
Penney, can you identify Raisin for us?
Sorry, General Caine, Raisin Caine. And so he's telling us what we need to build up for those mission planning materials. But how do you mission plan for something like this? This was not something that we were trained for. This was not something that we had anticipated. This was not something that our nation had even imagined. After the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union fell, the nation literally cut the Air Force in half. Cut it in half. And so all of those alert units used to ring our borders to protect our nation from those nuclear bombers that were going to come in and threaten us, mostly gone. There were only 5 units that were sitting alert that day, and we were not one of them.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our team to put up a slide that is an image of the flight paths of the hijacked aircraft. And it will show you too where the response came from Andrews. So the blue star there is approximately near, it's Andrews, now joint base Andrews. And you can see the really large area actually that is that the Northeast Air Defense Sector was defending, but the DC Air National Guard actually isn't part of that Northeast Air Defense Sector that also scrambled flights to protect against what they thought was happening, also confused and startled by actually what they realized as it happened that day. But maybe General Sasseville, you can talk to us about why the DC Air National Guard wasn't a part of that other command and what your command structure was like, where you took orders from.
Okay, so this is a big question about how the National Guard is structured. But before that, a little bit of context. During the Cold War, Andrews Air Force Base did have alert fighters there stationed there. That was just a byproduct of the Cold War construct. But time went on, and the biggest that the Air Force has been in terms of assets inside the National Guard came right after World War II when we did the big drawdown. We didn't know what to do with all these fighters, so we put them in the Guard. And then as time went on, they got modernized, but the squadrons came down. That's why you have eventually, out of dozens of alert fighter squadrons around the continental United States, you only end up with 5 on that day, like Lucky talked about. So one of them, for some interesting reason, is not the nation's capital. So the 121st, and we talked about that when I came up. I said, hey, this is a perfect base for alert. You got the great layout, right? And no, we don't do that. There's no plan to do such a thing. So the 121st, like all the other Guard squadrons, and it was back then, it's been this way since we started, and it remains that way today, is the boss is the governor of the state. Right, the governor drives, is the lead executive for the National Guard. There's a 2-star general that has the military command and control, essentially. But that's where the chain of command goes. And so on that day, we are essentially reporting to that chain of command, which is very separate and distinct from the federal chain of command, which is the President, the Secretary of Defense, through the combatant commanders. And that's how the federal side works. And as National Guardsmen, our number one job is to get ready to go do that work, right? That's the number one job of every Guard unit, is to be prepared to organize, train, and equip to go work for a Title X combatant commander, pick a location, Middle East, Europe, the Pacific. But when you're not doing that, you have a chain of command that's in the state. DC is different, but you get the idea. It's not federal. And so we're reacting not as part of NORAD that day. First of all, there was no NORAD on the base, and they're the people who are in charge of defending the country with 5 sites. And so we are reacting under a self-defense authority that each installation commander has by default. We can go on and on.
Yeah,
that.
we did get guidance from the sort of National Command Authority that morning. It came as a fax to our wing commander, then Brigadier General Dave Worley, who, as we stepped and ran to the airplanes after a very short abbreviated flight brief where we sketched out sort of a rough defense plan of how we would prevent further airplanes from coming into Washington. Our wing commander read us, at least my flight. Marc, Sasseville, and Heather had stepped shortly before us to go. We were just minutes behind them. It's one of those. Another Dan Caine Polaroid is Brigadier General Worley reading us this fax, which contained our rules of engagement, which were pretty liberal. It was on Sass and I to decide what we were going to do and how we were going to defend downtown DC. And one of the things that you hope for in the time of crisis is you hope and pray for great leadership. And so General Worley reads us these rules of engagement, and for me at least, I'm assuming he said the same thing for you. He looked at me. Now, mind you, this is the wing commander who's getting ready to have jets scramble out to defend the National Command Authority from an attack from unknown numbers and unknown directions. And he says, at least to myself and Brandon, and to me in particular, look, Dan, I don't know what you're going to face out there. And you're probably going to have to do some difficult things. But I want you to know that no matter what, I trust you. You're going to do the right thing, and I have your back no matter what. And you want to talk about saying the exact right thing at the right time. And tragically, a few years later, he and his wife were both killed when they were on the metro trains while leaving Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where they were volunteering for the wounded coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But, that's another example of this day. There's so many good stories that come out of 9/11. Todd Beamer and the passengers on Flight 93, many of the firefighters who are in the room right here, and General Worley, along with all of the other folks, maintenance troops and things like that just responded forward. So he gave us the rules of engagement, and then we went running to airplanes.
Thank you, General Caine. So you were armed when you took off.
I was, yeah. We had 2 heat-seeking missiles on both of our airplanes. We were not long after Marc and Heather, pretty quick, and we'd, as the morning was evolving quickly, I'd called over to the weapons storage area, which is a big bunker on the other side of Andrews at the time, and told the senior enlisted member on the phone, hey, I need you to bring over the live missiles. They didn't have a TV over there, so I think he thought I was nuts. But we got past that pretty quickly. And they brought the weapons over. And, it's another image of courage, right? On our flight line at Andrews at the time, it was beautiful. There were big green, lush pine trees around the edge of it. And you could walk out there after flying and you'd hear the ticking of the engines turning from the light breeze, and it was actually beautiful. And on that particular day, as you ran down the long sidewalk behind the squadron, we're only about 4.5 miles from the Pentagon. You could see this acrid black smoke rising above those trees, and yet those crew chiefs and weapons loaders and folks like that, the look in their eyes, I remember climbing in the jet as Marc and Heather taxied out, the look in their eyes was determination. It was dedication. It was, we are not going to be distracted from what is happening. They had a mission to do, and they did it. It was fantastic.
I'd like to interject there because I remember listening to you make that phone call. And as a young lieutenant, I had done as much studying as I could on my craft. Again, something very important to our young folks out here who will hopefully very shortly take your own oath of service. And I remember being shocked because we don't fly around and train with live weapons on the aircraft. I mean, they're captive air training missiles. They're basically concrete tubes with electronics. And so we were not loaded up normally, right? So when Raisin's making that phone call, which, there was a discussion amongst the leadership with General Worley and Sass and Raisin, what are we going to do here to make a decision to call down to the bomb dump and have those guys build up those missiles. Now, normally this is something that comes down in an air tasking order. It comes down from the CAOC 3 days in advance to tell the weapons guys what they need to build up so they're matching the right weapons for the mission and the jet and so forth. I mean, this is the military, the world's largest bureaucracy, right? I mean, and here's Raisin making this phone call, bring me some missiles. It really is a testament to two things: the leadership of the team and the squadron that day, because they were willing to take the risk to build up those live explosives, right? As well as how they could then contain that risk. But they knew what needed to be done, and they were willing to put their own rank on the line to make that happen, as well as smartly mitigate what those possible consequences could be. Because we could load them up, fly around with them. As long as we didn't hit the pickle button, we'd be okay, right? As long as we didn't launch those weapons. And the other piece that I think is really important is the credibility and the trust that Raisin had built up with those teams, with the kids down in the bomb dump. Because here they are building up a missile with no orders, no context, but just simply trust in their leadership.
A little bit more context. So in the 90s, mid-90s, when President Clinton came on scene, right, got inaugurated, there was a lot of concern by the Secret Service about using live weapons at Andrews. And a lot of you probably don't remember this, and I know a lot of you weren't born, but there was concern about how the military was going to react to President Clinton and if there was going to be an issue there. So there were some very strict rules put into place about who can use live weapons and how does that work. So to reinforce both these previous comments, that was a huge deal for those kids and for our maintenance team, Rudy Kenzel, Skip Denman, to say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and do this.
Chief Bowman, yeah.
Chief Bowman, that whole crowd there to say, yeah, okay, we're going to go out on a limb and put all that stuff together. And these aren't easy things. On purpose, they get stored separately because you don't want the damn things blowing up on you. So you got a warhead over here, you got a seeker over here, you got fins, you got body, right? So it takes a long time to put them together, and then you got to truck them out. You could drive them around the other side of the airfield. But the maintainers were all over it. They understood, and they were part of the team doing exactly what was required at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, comparatively, it was, I think, a low-risk decision compared to everything else that was going on that day. So, I mean, that was really about, the greatest thing the United States has in its military is our enlisted force. It's not the officers. It's the non-commissioned officers. And that's what happened that day. You could see non-commissioned leadership happening. We were focused on other things. They were focused on getting the JOB done. So, that's what makes us so good.
So General Sasseville, if you could talk a little bit more about why, when you two launched, when you took off, you were in a status of being weapons free. So what happened there, and what were you trying to do?
So the to reiterate, we talked about, Dan just talked about rules of engagement, ROE. That is a set of rules, for those of you who don't know, that's a set of rules that defines exactly what are the requirements for you to be able to employ ordnance. If you're going to shoot something, if you're going to drop a bomb, you got to have rules of engagement that have been approved by leadership that talk about under what circumstances you're going to do that. And so as things are unfolding that morning, and maintenance is working hard to get airplanes ready because they've gotten the word now that they saw Flight 93, right? The White House jock saw Flight 93 start to turn around. Everybody's getting concerned, and that's what they wanted us to get moving against. We didn't have a lot of time. I didn't get the great speech from Dave Worley. Wish I had, but we didn't have the time. Our concern at that moment is we got to get something in the air. We're under attack. We're thinking December 7th, 1941, which, by the way, was almost exactly 60 years, save a couple months prior. We may come back to that later on. We're not going to get caught flat-footed. We got to put up some kind of a response, some kind of defense. And so that's the reaction that you see from us. Dan also talked about Brandon Rasmussen, who's not with us today, but he was one of our wingmen and one of our foreship. Knowing that if we keep two on the ground, get them weapons, load them up, we can get airborne, hold whatever's coming down the pike off, right? If they're going to launch more airplanes at us, at least we'll have something in the air and have some kind of a presence to stop them from going into the White House or the Capitol or wherever the next wave was going to go into. I'll let Lucky go.
So when Sass and I took off, we didn't have weapons. We had 105 rounds of training projectile bullets, so think 20 millimeter BB guns, each in the nose of our aircraft. And that was not going to be sufficient, even with both of our entire rounds, so 210 was not going to be sufficient to take down an airliner. I had gone through hijack training when I went through my basic qualification course at F-16 school, and it was basically a briefing because we weren't going to bother wasting jet fuel training on how to do this, and it basically involved doing a single-side offset intercept to the hijacked airliner, trying to get the attention of the hijackers, telling them to meet you on a specific frequency, and then escorting them somewhere to go land. Right? So that then we could have the appropriate agencies take over the hostage negotiations and so forth. That was the paradigm that had existed prior to that morning. So when we went and said, all right, how are we going to skin this cat, this briefing, right? Because there was a briefing. And Sass and Raisin were, Sass is the flight lead of the foreship. Raisin's number 3, so he's a deputy lead. But we know we're kind of operating right now as two tactical leaders in the squadron, figuring out what we're going to do. And that's where we first come to the recognition that if we don't have weapons in time, that this now could potentially become a suicide mission. Because with 105 rounds each, it wouldn't be enough. And that's the first time that we really realized that that's what could be required of us. That's it.
So a situation for which you had no training or preparation on those maneuvers, but you quickly came up with a plan for how you would have stopped had you encountered an airliner that was being used as a bomb. So what would you have done?
When I got off active duty in 1999, I went to fly with Delta Airlines, Atlas Airlines first, Delta Airlines. So I knew what an airliner was about. I knew the systems on an airliner. I knew what it could do, and I knew what it couldn't do. So I had a pretty good idea, based upon the training that I had, of where the weak spots were and what I was going to have to do to take an airplane out, which, again, you should be thankful we don't train to shoot down airliners. as the American public. But that day we had to figure it out. So as we're leaving, I thought that we're going to be together. Normally when you fly in twos, and it was Heather and I and Dan and Brandon and the other two ship taking off, as we've talked about before, that we're going to be together for most of the sortie. It didn't turn out like that because we had to split up because there was so much going on and it was just a challenging environment. So I figured if we could disable the airplane by hitting the cockpit and destroying the part of the machine that was inserting flight commands into it, and then destroying the tail, that would render the airplane not flyable at some point. And then that would be the way to prevent it from hitting its target, which was our primary concern. And that's what we were trying to balance in the time. That's what we're wrestling with is, first of all, here you are, we're talking, thinking about taking down an airliner full of presumably American citizens. There's probably some foreigners in there too, but it's predominantly American citizens, which have been turned into a weapon that are going to hit maybe a large part of our government, senior leaders in our government. Maybe not the government, maybe it's another government building, still a very big symbol. And that's what we're struggling with at that time, at that moment in time. Eventually, like Dan said, the passengers on Flight 93 took that decision space away from us because they paid the ultimate price, and we didn't have to wrestle with that. We didn't have to execute any of those plans, but those are the things that we're thinking about.
And Flight 93 landed in uninhabited space near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where no one was killed on the ground. Crash landed in uninhabited space where there was no one on the ground and no one else was killed other than those folks, which wouldn't necessarily have been the case if we had a different point
They
of
made the
interception.
ultimate sacrifice. The passengers on Flight 93 knew what they were doing, and they made the choice to protect and defend our nation. They are the true heroes. And as we remember, we say never forget, but as we remember, I think it's important to also remember why they made that choice. Why did they choose to sacrifice their own lives to protect us? And I think it's because they know how precious this thing called America is. We talk a lot about the greatest generation, but to me, the proof that their DNA still lives in us today is the choices that the passengers that day made, as well as the first responders and everyone who sacrificed their lives, not only on September 11th here in New York, but in the months that followed afterwards to do the cleanup and the rescue.
So I'd like to put up the image of the F-16 escorting Air Force One from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska to Andrews Air Force Base.
The glamour shot of him.
And this,
I like that glamour shot.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
can you talk about that part of your mission?
So that's the second sortie. The first sortie, we're airborne. Dan and Brandon get airborne. We land. We get gas. I think we ate a hot dog. We went to debrief the leadership of what had happened. So this is the second sortie.
A couple hours later, yeah.
Yeah, in the afternoon.
Pretty much, early, like 1700-ish, right? 1700.
Yeah, I think that's ballpark.
Yeah.
Long day.
The interesting part about how that got set up was Lucky and I are in the cap. Raisin set that whole thing up. And
Sir, can you talk about what the CAP was?
Good one. Combat Air Patrol. So Combat Air Patrol is a term that's been around for years, and basically it's how fighters defend a piece of terrain or a piece of sky. And so you basically sit up there in circles and you wait for the bad guys to come. Sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. On a day like today, we were really expecting, we were positioning ourselves to be ready for more people to come.
So after Sass and I flew out, And then he has us return back to DC after we find nothing because the passengers on Flight 93 had already crashed the airliner. We returned back. We didn't know that at the time yet. And we're setting up a combat air patrol. I say we. It's actually SAS doing the work because I'm a wingman. And then Raisin and Igor are up there as well. And between SAS and Raisin, they worked with Potomac air traffic control. And there's different layers of air traffic control within airspace. Potomac approach and Potomac departure really kind of manage the airspace that's lower around the DC area. And these are FAA civilians. Their job is normally to sequence and separate aircraft on flight paths to get them into and out of airports safely with enough distance that they're not, incurring any kind of risk. And these individuals immediately were able to transition their mental processes from separating airplanes to bringing them together, because Raisin and SAS are telling them how to do that, how to speak fighter pilot language, right? See the airport there at National, let's call National Bullseye. If you see something, an airplane, a radar contact east, and it's 20 miles away from National Airport at 3,000 feet, we want you to say Bullseye 090 for 23,000. And that lets us as fighter pilots know how to search on our radar. Because remember, this was a day before this 24/7 news cycle, before we got alerts and beeps and squeaks on our phones all the time, right? And so if you had stopped being plugged into the news or the radio or your television that morning, you got up, you watched the 6 a.m. news, and then you went off and did whatever it was that you were doing that day, you were still living in a pre-9/11 world. So there were still a lot of general aviation aircraft flying around that day that had no idea that the airspace had been shut down, closed. And so there was a lot of these small little unknown airplanes, general aviation, with no harm, no intent, just totally ignorant, as well as a tremendous amount of first responders, military airlift, and so forth. And at the same time, we still don't know, are there still bad guys out there? Is there some other way that they might come in? So SAS and Raisin did a phenomenal job of communicating what we needed from air traffic control, and they were phenomenal in their mental agility and changing their thought paradigms and then speaking, our language, because pretty quickly like that, they were able to begin to communicate what the battle space looked like for us. And so I just want to give a shout out to the air traffic controllers because they rocked that day. They were awesome.
The 9/11 Commission struggled to understand what had happened that day in terms of the air defense response because of communication challenges and the uncertainty and the ambiguity that accompanied all that communication. But you point out that actually many creative responses were devised and immediately enacted in the aftermath that protected many. The Flight 175 didn't run into another aircraft on its way, in part because of air traffic controllers who had those kinds of responses. And the work that you did to deter those other aircrafts and to get the planes on the ground had a tremendous impact. It's really an extraordinary story, General Sasseville.
So back to the communication point. The airplanes have these radios that you put special codes in to get the encryption. And if you put the code in, his airplane, my airplane, and her airplane, we can all talk, encrypted. That day, we didn't have the codes because we weren't part of NORAD. So on that sortie, by the time we get airborne, there's a tanker that's on in the area now that we can go get gas from and stay in the air longer.
That's for the second sortie.
For the second sortie. Normally, with the configuration, the gas tanks that we had, you're airborne for 2.5 hours. With a tanker, with a big airplane that's got gas inside of it and a boom, a tube that comes out and can put gas into your airplane, you can stay up for 4 hours, which is what we really wanted. There's also an AWACS, which is a big airplane with a big dish on top. I'm sure you guys have seen that. It spins around. That's a radar in there, and they can see everything, and they're doing the same kind of air traffic controller piece. But we don't have that crypto code, so they can't talk to us. And so the controller instead of, he knows that we need to go out to the west, right? And so he says, hey, I've got a special mission for you. I said, go ahead. And so since he can't talk secret, he whispers to me. 270 for 140 miles, 270 meaning west, and that's where he wants Lucky and I to go. So I thought that was a kind of a funny thing, and the bad guys will never figure that out. And I don't know if the bad guys are listening to that. So we go out there, and it turns out to be Air Force One. Again, President Bush started his day in Florida in a second grade classroom, I think. That's famous conversation that he and his chief of staff, I think, I can't remember what his name. And so he had been moving around the country. And so finally he says, okay, I got to get back to DC. He's coming in back to DC. And that's where Heather and I go out and meet Air Force One. And then we're bringing him back in. We also did have a new piece of equipment, which was a special data link. And we did have the codes for that, right? And so what that does is we can get very far apart from each other. And in our cockpit, I can see where she is. She's way out there. So as we're coming into DC, again, we don't know what we're coming back to. We don't know if this is a full-on big attack, if there's going to be people trying to shoot us down from the ground, if there's people going after Air Force One. So what I do is I ask her to go 10 miles in front, and then I'll be next to Air Force One. And we had two F-15s that had also left the cap with us, right, for more help in case we needed it, to come back in. And Heather was not really very happy about that because she knew my intent was if they were going to shoot at us, they're going to shoot her first.
I was the chum.
And they weren't going to be able to shoot Air Force One.
Yeah, I just want to talk real quick about the tanker crews, the air refueling tankers. So after Sass and Lucky landed, there's sort of this global emergency frequency. We call it GUARD, where everybody can hear, every airplane can hear it. And I'm up there asking for a tanker. And these two mid-20s guys with a person that plugs the airplanes in the back come up in a KC-10, a DC-10 tanker. They're very young aviators. The guy in the left seat has just been checked out as a captain on this giant fuel tanker, and comes up and gives us gas, and we're fantastic that day. They were giving gas to F-15s and F-16s, and about 3.5, 4 weeks later. Just a little bit longer than that. I'm deployed at this point in time, and I'm again asking for gas. I'm over Afghanistan. I can't leave the Army Special Forces guys on the ground, and I ask for a tanker to come up. And this tanker leaves the safe airspace in the southern end of Afghanistan and drives up right over the fight where we're at, because I cannot leave the guys on the ground. And I get on the tanker, and it is the same three dudes. So, these memories of these days just percolate through us with such great examples of not us. We just did our job, but these other folks that were doing fantastic things that day.
They said, "You again?"
Well, yeah, pretty much. Needless to say, I sent them some Jack Daniels.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll see if we have questions from our audience here. And that's just about, you all did your jobs in, I'd say, extraordinary fashion that day. But just something you mentioned, General Sasseville, about how in a presidential transition in the 90s, there was concern about how the president would be received as commander-in-chief and what the armed forces might do and respond. Presidential transitions often bring that kind of anxiety. We've had concern about that, and many people have raised that in recent months. And I wonder your thoughts about, especially being in the Guard, and for General Caine and Major Penney too, what about the challenge of potentially using force against American citizens if ordered to do so? And what about the dual service to a civilian leader, as the governor in that case for the Guard, as well as to the federal military missions?
So when you're talking about using the military, are you talking about in this scenario, or are you talking about what we're reading about today?
I think we should leap forward to today and what you think about today. So, and based on what you learned from 9/11 and in your leadership experience since.
So this is actually pretty easy. In my last tour as Vice Chief of the Guard Bureau, I did a lot of work with international partners and allies, which is one of our key strengths as a nation, I think. And we cannot be who we are as a nation without partners and allies throughout the globe. One of them, from a South American country, actually, at one point mentioned, you know, the very minute that somebody in uniform puts their hand on a citizen of that country, you will lose it. You will lose that country. So the body of legal structure that we have, the policies that we have in this country, the way we've built the National Guard, the way we've built the Coast Guard, the way we have constructed all of that, that is hard to understand, and a lot of America doesn't understand, and that's okay. I think the people who do understand it are the ones who need to know it. Gives us what exactly we need. And we don't need to use the military, the U.S. military, to do law enforcement functions and to take care of challenges in terms of civil disturbance or any other kind of scenario that you can imagine. That's not what the U.S. military is built to do. That's not what you as American citizens should be asking the military to do. I'm not saying you are, but it's all built for a reason, and I think we've got it right, and we shouldn't change anything.
Thank you. Major Penney?
I can't follow up with that. I mean, I think you framed that very well. And as a nation, what we have is precious. Our peaceful transfer of power, the laws that we have in place, that is broad enough with our freedoms, the various freedoms that we have that are enshrined in our Constitution, within our Bill of Rights, and within the entire corpus of the law, allow us to have divergent and diverse viewpoints and engage in these debates, and at the same time have faith and belief in our citizenship, civility, and the rule of law, and the continuity of our governance through personalities. And when I say through, it's not through those personalities, it's as those personalities move in and out of office. The continuity of our governance is truly a precious and unique element of America. And I think that's, again, that is stronger than any one of us as individuals.
General Caine?
I don't have anything to add. I mean, I think they summed it up pretty well.
Okay. We have some folks with mics on either side here. Does anybody have a question for our panelists? Right here down in the front.
Hi, thanks for being here. How many alert stations do we have now? I believe you said we had 5. Do we have more? Or
Yeah, I'm not so sure that number's not classified. So
Let's just say you're well protected.
Yeah.
You're
No. It's
oh, yeah,
not
you
classified.
probably know.
Yeah. We have 15 fighters, 5 tankers, and 1 AWACS unit that are all on alert now.
I will say something about Andrews, and we've been gone a long time, but since 9/11, the number of times that the horn has gone off out there, and the maintenance folks have run to the airplanes, and the pilots have run to the airplanes. Raise your hand if you think it's 10. How about 100? 200? 3,000? 5,000? More than 8,000 times.
What are you responding to?
all sorts of things, airplanes that have a problem, emergencies, a beautiful day in the summer and somebody turns the wrong direction. That's how serious the nation takes the defense of Washington, D.C. now. And that's an unclassified number, but it's significant.
That's the vigilance.
Yeah.
So
And there's
to
a-
pull that thread a little bit, somebody's not talking on the radio, an airplane isn't talking on the radio when they're supposed to be talking, everybody starts to get really nervous.
Yeah.
They turn the wrong way when they turn right, when they're supposed to turn left. So the entire airspace system is so tight and monitored so closely by air traffic control, by Secret Service, by all these other government agencies because of 9/11, and that's what Dan's talking about, is anything goes wrong, you're going to end up scrambling. Somebody's going to start moving towards the airplanes to take off.
And every time it's as if it's 9 a.m. on September 11th, 2001. And that's a testament to the crews, maintenance and operations crews and firefighters and finance people and everybody else that makes that happen for the United States out there at Andrews Air Force Base 24/7, 365. It's extraordinary.
About one more question here. Can you take the mic, please, there, Charlie? Thank you. Sorry.
Is it okay if I share the story I shared with you last year when Flight 11 flew right over my apartment?
Sure.
I'll stand up. I'm not an Air Force guy, but I am a pilot, small plane pilot. Spent a lot of time in Indiana at Bunker Hill Air Force Base. I was president of the Flying Squirrels Incorporated. But that has nothing to do with what I want to tell you. I live in Greenwich Village, corner of Bleecker and Thompson Streets. Beautiful morning, severe clear. And out of nowhere, I heard this plane fly over. It was less than 1,000 feet above the ground. And I knew instantly, simply because I'd spent a lot of time around planes, a lot of air shows, the Cleveland Air Show and other places. I'd heard SR-71s fly over and everything else like that. Immediately, like that, I knew it was a twin-engine jet at full throttle. But I ran out to the balcony looking uptown, and World Trade Center is downtown. I said, what the is the military doing exercises in the middle of Manhattan? I never conceived that it could be. So to make what could be a long story short, I stepped back into the apartment and I heard this big and someone on the street yelled up, I'm 3 stories up, oh my God, a plane's hit the World Trade Center. And I said, are you kidding me? My wife works there. And she was on the 97th floor of Tower 1. Okay. And I ran down, I was just in, short summer pajamas, bare feet, working at my desk. I ran down the stairs and went out in the middle of Thompson Street looking right down, and you could see the number 1 World Trade Center rising up from behind other buildings. And I saw the gash and I thought, oh my God, what do I do? What do I do? This is all in my head. I go down there, no, it'll be da-da-da-da. I says, 2 people can't find each other. She'll come down. I'll be home waiting for her. And I ran upstairs, tried to call her, got the fast busy signal. And the next thing I did is I picked up the phone book. They had phone books back then. They're about this thick from Manhattan. And I called the FBI. And because I knew something that no one else did. I knew it was deliberate. I knew by the sound that it was a twin engine jet at full throttle, but I thought it was something like a F-14, et cetera, something like that. And I told him, I said, that was no accident. That was deliberate. And I said, he flew right over the apartment, and I hung up, and then her father called from Wales because she was British. I said, Howard, I don't know what's going on. And I realized the guy at the FBI doesn't believe me. So I called him back. I said, listen, I want you to know I'm a pilot. I know what I'm talking about. He says, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Fast forward a year later, first anniversary. I'm in the tent to read names. I'm not the kind of person that can sit on the sideline. I've got to do something. And I walk in, I see Hillary Clinton. I knew her from some previous stuff before. And as I'm talking to her, relaying the story of the morning I just told you, I hear this voice saying, that voice, your voice. I know your voice. I'm the one you called. I'm the one that answered your call. And he told me, he said, you're the first person that got us on to the idea that this was not an accident.
Thank you for sharing.
It was, so in my aviation teenage years,
Yeah.
it carried forward.
Thank you.
For sharing.
Thank you, Charlie. Mr. Charles Wolf, with a sign of, like, you found your tanker again on the other side of the world. You connected to the person on the other end of the phone, not long after. So we have one more question right here that I'm going to go ahead and take just because of the enthusiasm of the questioner, and then we'll have a wrap. So
This is really just about Air Force One. When you mentioned it, it got me thinking about something I now suddenly wonder. When the president comes and goes from D.C., is he usually doing it from Andrews, or is there a closer place? Or?
Yeah, you got the former wing commander of Andrews right
Okay.
there. He can tell you all
And then
about
from
it.
there, you helicopter him.
That's why he
to the
doesn't have
White
any
House
hair left,
lawn.
you see?
Right? Okay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
please join me in thanking these extraordinary U.S.